Welcome to Season 3 of the Sober Motivation Podcast. Join me, Brad, each week as my guests and I share incredible, inspiring, and powerful sobriety stories. We are here to show sobriety is possible, one story at a time. Let's go! In this episode of the podcast, we have Thomas, who shares his inspiring journey towards sobriety. Thomas discusses his childhood and his teenage years filled with minor troubles. He recounts how his drinking habits escalated during his bartending career, and later as a brand ambassador for alcohol companies. Thomas speaks about the moment he realized he needed help. His story underscores the importance of community, seeking help, and the transformative power of sobriety. And this is Thomas's story on the Sober Motivation Podcast. It was vital in keeping me accountable. It doesn't interrupt my life, it only enhances my life. People in my program swore by it. These are just a few quotes from SoberLink users. SoberLink is not just any breathalyzer, it's the breathalyzer, designed specifically for those in recovery from alcohol addiction. How it works is simple. You'll test at the same time every day, 2 to 3 times a day. It has a built-in camera that will take a photo during your test, so it knows it's you testing. Tamper sensors will flag any attempts to cheat, and instant, easy-to-read results are sent directly to your loved ones because it's not just about proving you're sober. It's about sharing your success, establishing patterns of trust, and dispelling doubts with hard evidence. SoberLink, proof of sobriety at your fingertips. Visit soberlink.com/recover to sign up and receive $50 off your device today. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, everybody. Thank you for hanging out. With over 150 episodes now out there, it's been an incredible journey. And I want to give a big shout out to SoberBuddy. The meetings that we're having over there are just incredible and seem to be better by the day. A lot of new members, a lot of listeners from the podcast have joined SoberBuddy, and I would love to invite you to come and check out our virtual community with over 40 live support meetings per month, as well as the Sober Superstar course, everything you need to get started, as well as a supportive and incredible community. I'll drop the link below in the show notes where you can get a free 30-day trial. I host 3 groups per week on the app myself, and I'm really active around there supporting our members. And I would love to meet you. So check out the free trial, see if it's a hit for you. So many people are getting and staying sober because of their experience on SoberBuddy. Now let's get to this episode. Welcome back to another episode of the Sober Motivation Podcast. Today we've got Thomas with us. Thomas, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, man. Thank you for reaching out and being willing to jump on here and share your story with all of us.
No, more than happy to. Thanks for having me.
Of course, 100%. So what was it like for you growing up?
I think my childhood was fairly normal. I think that a lot of people who struggle with addictions have these, absolutely horrendous childhoods, and that a lot of things stem from that. I don't think that mine was necessarily that bad at all. I grew up in Chicago. My parents got divorced when I was pretty young. My dad stayed in Detroit. My mom came here to Chicago, Illinois. And I still saw my dad a great deal. They were still very friendly. So I didn't really have a lot of trauma or anything from that. But when I was 7, my father died of cancer, which obviously was pretty hard. But I also think that at the age of 7, it's hard to process. But then from there, we moved around a few times, all within the Chicago or Chicagoland area, bounced from school to school. Pretty happy childhood. And then, come my teenage years, I, started getting in a little trouble here and there. Nothing huge, no real jail time or anything like that. I got arrested for graffiti a few times, just childish, kind of petty kid shit. But overall, a pretty good childhood. I had a younger sister. She passed away about 11 years ago, but it was my mom, my sister, and I for my entire childhood.
Yeah, wow. Looking back at, and even hearing a lot of stories here on the podcast, it seems like it's maybe even close to a 50-50 split about sort of some things going all right. I mean, that must have been, and I'm just thinking about it here, really difficult for you at 7 too, for the situation with your father. I mean, do you do counseling or do you talk about anything like at that age? Is there anything that goes on?
My mom did a good job. She knew a therapist, so I definitely went and chatted with her a few times. But I think that when you're 7, it's hard to fully understand your emotions and your feelings, let alone go verbalize that and speak about what you're feeling to somebody. I have a 7-year-old daughter now, and I know that, she's incredibly intelligent and she has a hard time, sometimes expressing herself. So they do offer therapy and counseling for that sort of thing, but I only went a few times and I think it was kind of lost on me.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, I still struggle with that at times.
Sure.
Here at 36, right? Yeah. So you do that growing up, and then like school and everything. How does that look for you? I mean, you're getting in some like this probably regular kind of teenage trouble, right? That a lot of us find ourselves in.
Dumb teenage stuff. School was good. I was never a good student. I wasn't a great athlete until my high school and athletic career was nearly at an end. That's when I kind of fell into myself. I always had this kind of goofy, weird body. My feet were too big, or I was too tall or too chubby. It never all just kind of fit together until I was like a junior or senior. And then it just kind of ended. Not a great student though, ever. I excelled in the classes that I really liked and didn't do great in the classes that I found boring or not interesting, or I just wouldn't go to them that often. So I definitely wasn't on the honor roll or even close to it.
You and me both, man. I struggled with school a lot too. I mean, it was tough for me though, because struggling with school, I mean, because it really hurt my self-confidence. It was valued. The value of doing well in high school was really high. I mean, my family didn't really push it on me, do well or else, but they loved to see me do well. And I felt like it was a really tough thing for me. I was diagnosed with ADHD too, or right before high school probably. And I had trouble paying attention. And then I was on Adderall, and then I stopped taking the Adderall, and the things just blew up because the impulse control wasn't there, and I got in a ton of trouble. But that's a whole nother story for another day.
I mean, I was diagnosed. I had ADHD. I was on Ritalin for a long time, and I stopped taking it because I hated it.
Yeah. Man, it's so interesting. So you can, okay, cool. So you're with me on that. And my mom used to give it to me. I mean, I used to go down to the office. I don't know if you guys had that too. You go down to the office when you're younger and they'd give you your medication if you had 2 in a day. And then when I hit high school, I had like maybe this extended release stuff. And I used to just take it because it was what, the doctor said and everything. My parents were like, you got to take this. And then I remember one day I missed it. We were rushing around and I didn't take it. And let me tell you, it was the strangest feeling in the entire world because I felt like for once I was alive. And I was feeling emotions, and I was just like, what happens if I kind of push the limits here and I just pretend to take it? And that was just like the start of like really serious behavioral stuff really crept into my life. But I felt like really robotic on the medication. And it's also so strange and makes a ton of sense looking back about how many people I've talked to on the show that have struggled with ADHD in one way or another and then become addicted or struggle with alcohol. And I think getting way far ahead of ourselves, I think what the Adderall did was slow down my thoughts. And what alcohol did as well was slow down my thoughts. And it was like maybe in a way a self-medication thing, moving forward, but getting way far ahead of ourselves. But it's always an interesting dynamic. And I'm always so curious about what role the untreated ADHD played in the further addiction, in my story, at least. Where do you go after high school? What's your vision after high school?
Like a lot of high school seniors, I didn't really have a vision. I actually didn't graduate high school. I got in some trouble at my high school towards the back half of senior year. So I was almost done. And they essentially kind of gave me an ultimatum of drop out right now or you're expelled. So I dropped out. I got my GED, went to community college for a couple years before going to a more classic 4-year college here in Chicago. Bounced around, moved around a bit, moved to the West Coast for a little while when I was like 19. But I didn't really have a vision. But the entire time I was in college, I was working in restaurants as well. I was like a busboy, a waiter. I kind of did all the different positions. And then my junior year of college, I started bartending right when I turned 21 and just kind of fell in love with it. And college took a back seat. And I just knew pretty early on into the bar career that like, this is it. I found what I want to do, what I'm good at. I'm a very outgoing, very social person. So it all just kind of clicked for me. When you ask what I wanted to do, I had no idea at all.
Yeah, I'm with you too. So that's kind of your first job, right? I mean, that's probably a really common job. I'm thinking from my experience working, right? For students, it's flexible. You can work more in the evenings. You can do go to school during the day.
Yeah.
And you get involved. I mean, what boxes was it checking for you? I know when I started working in restaurants, like I found a sense of community, a sense of belonging, and you meet people and you get invited to different things. It was really cool in that aspect. I mean, doing the job itself, I wouldn't say I found the passion and the fire for it like you did, but those other elements were attractive.
And I know you're recording out of Canada, correct? So I don't know, is tipping culture big in Canada? I can't recall from the last time I was there.
Yeah. People leave tips.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest boxes it checked for me was just making a lot of money and making it quickly, and more money than, all of my friends who were in their late teens, early 20s. I'm walking away with the minimum couple $100 a night.
Yeah.
But I think that what I really loved about the bar world and bartending is it goes back to that ADD or ADHD thing. I have a hard time. I can't sit at a desk for 9 hours or 8 hours and do a job. I physically don't have the ability to do that. But what I loved about bars is over the course of a night, I have 500, 600 different people in front of me. So my entire job is a 1 or 2 minute interaction 500 times. And for somebody who has concentration issues, it's an excellent job. So it felt like home for me. But also, I was 20. I'm getting to hang out in bars. And when you bartend, you kind of run the show. And I think it stroked my ego a lot. And it just all clicked. I loved it.
Yeah. And when do you start drinking? Were you drinking in high school a little bit or not up until 21 or?
I drank in high school, but it wasn't a lot. I would go to a party and have a couple of beers every now and then, or, I definitely got drunk a few times in high school, but I don't think that I was by any stretch of the imagination an alcoholic in high school or drinking too much or anything. It was kind of your classic high school, have a few beers, 1 or 2 weekends a month. My father was an alcoholic before he died. I never saw him drink. He was in recovery for my entire life. But it's one thing that my mom always warned me about was, you got this thing in you, your dad had it. So be careful, tread lightly. And I always just kind of took that to heart. So I definitely had friends who were drinking more than me, but it was never really my thing in high school. I think I started drinking more and more towards the tail end of my college career. And when I was starting to work in bars pretty much full time at that point, it's such a huge part of bar culture is, you get off work at 1, 2 in the morning, there's not a lot of places you can go. You're not going to go to a cafe and read a book and have a sandwich for dinner. You're going to go to a bar. It's kind of all there is. And you're going to go out with all of your other bar friends, and people from other bars are going to come there. So it kind of becomes your entire life, your entire social circle is bars for so many people that I know. And there's not a lot of things to do at a bar other than drink. So I would definitely say it started ramping up from there.
Yeah. So where do you go from there? I mean, you've got your first bar job. I mean, you're really feeling it too. And it makes so much sense, I think, with the ADHD stuff, right? Because it's that stimulation. It's almost when I look back, like that chaos. I thrived in it, when things got busy or you had to move and shake and people would just say, well, what's going on? And then you're able to remain calm and you kind of find your way there. I mean, how do you progress forward?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I really loved is the immediate gratification from bartending. It's going back to the ADD thing one more time. It just, you have a small task in front of you, you do it, somebody pays you, your job is done. It's like thumbs up, you did it. And you just do that over and over again. But my first bar job was at this little mom and pop hamburger place. It was by no means like a cool bar or like a club or anything like that. But then I started working in more high-end restaurants, downtown Chicago, pretty well-known, well-acclaimed places. And then I was running my own bar at a very large restaurant here on Michigan Avenue in Chicago by the time I was 26, and loved it. The bar was getting a lot of press. I was getting written up in different magazines, newspapers. It was a lot of fun. I thought, holy shit, this is incredible. Drinking a good amount. The owner of that bar, funny story, would later become my sponsor. He'd been sober for 15 years at that point. But after working for him, I got approached to start working for alcohol brands or the suppliers. So I worked for Moet Hennessy for a few years, and my whole job was to be a brand ambassador, which is essentially going to bars, being on the other side of the bar, though, sitting with the guests and building relationships with the bar managers and bar owners and buying people drinks, and really just trying to get more bars and restaurants to carry your products, use them in cocktails or put them on a menu or just put it on the back bar. But very quickly, my entire life became, I can't say it became bars because my life was already bars, but it switched from working on bars to sitting at a bar. And that I was doing that, 5, 6, 8 hours a day. And then by the end of my brand ambassador career, I'd spent 4 years working for Bacardi. It was a great job, a lot of fun. But yeah, I was definitely drinking heavily pretty much throughout the entire thing.
Yeah. I know we even talked about too, before we jumped on here, just the level of like how things are normalized, especially with this position, and then, working in the bars and going out and those routines that we get into, right? Like we start at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock and we work till 1 or 2, and you're sort of out of that like 7 a.m. wake up or that 8 a.m. wake up for maybe somebody that's going to work 9 to 5. And I remember too, I was able to sleep off a lot of the hangovers that I had because I wasn't going to have to show up until 4 or 5. And then I do remember times where we definitely carried it too far. And even at 4 or 5 in the evening or early evening, you were still feeling from the night before. So what impact did that have on you? Like just how normalized things were to drink. And if you're doing that during the day for a job, maybe the lines are getting blurred here about what time is it okay to drink? When do I start? All that stuff I'm thinking about.
Oh, 100%. I think when I was working behind bars and bartending and running bars, there were months at a time, especially here in Chicago in the middle of the winter when it gets dark at 4 p.m., there were months that I wouldn't see daylight, I felt, because I'm getting home at 4 a.m. and, maybe later, sun's not up. I'm going to bed and waking up at 4 in the afternoon, getting ready for work, and it's dusk already. It's just, that was a wild time. But then I think that when I started working for these companies, working for brands, I wanted to represent my companies well. I wouldn't really go drink at bars or restaurants when I would visit them during the day. I probably gained, we call it the brand ambassador 15, where I gained about 15 pounds in my first year because I'm going from restaurant to restaurant and just like an appetizer or something. But definitely towards the tail end of it, I, every now and then I'll order a drink with lunch and just have a sip. And then, that quickly turned into I'll have the whole drink and it just kind of takes over. So yeah, definitely blurs the lines a bit, where I found myself spending more time at bars at noon than any person should. So, and over the time, it just kind of, it starts to break you a little bit, or at least it did for me. I know a ton of people in that field who are totally fine doing it, but it became harder and harder for me.
Well, yeah. And you go back to the history with, what your mom brought up with your dad too, right? That there could be potentially something there for you. So when's the first time? So you're going through all this, right? You're wrapped up in the cycle, man. I'm just reflecting back to like my thing with the restaurants and the drinking every day and, all that stuff, man. I don't know if I ever had one thought, like in a 4-year span about, well, maybe I had 1 or 2, but it was only because I woke up in really bad shape. But like not many outside of that where I thought, hey, this is a problem. Or, hey, like, maybe I could do something else with my life. But I'm wondering in your story, if throughout all of this, if you ever had that, internal conversation or maybe in a mirror or something with yourself about, maybe the drinking's a problem.
You know, yes and no. My mom brought it up to me a few times, especially when I was working in bars and she wouldn't see me for weeks on end. And, she would see me and I would come downstairs like from my apartment. She'd come to pick me up looking like gaunt and clearly hungover, where she would make some comments and I'd be very dismissive. Another time is the gentleman who owns the bar and restaurant that I used to work at, who would later sponsor me. His name's Billy. He sat me down once or twice because there were a few times where I'm at work, just like on the verge of death, or, stories would get around about behavior that happened, the night prior at the bar, and he would always catch wind of it. And there were a few times where he sat me down and just asked, "Are you an alcoholic?" And being a young 20-something hotshot, in my own head bartender, it's like, no, not at all. Don't even worry about it. So there were definitely times that I thought, or, at least had the brief conversation with myself, but I was always incredibly dismissive of it, which I've found is incredibly easy for people with addiction issues to do. It's the classic trope of, I don't have a problem. Like, I could stop anytime, but looking back, I don't think I could have. But my drinking really escalated during COVID. When COVID hit, I was going through a very hard time personally as well. My wife and I were separating. We had a young daughter. She was 3 at the time. And then COVID hit and it was all in the same month. And I just felt like my life is just, what the fuck are we doing? And that's when I started to spiral. I was drinking during the day. I was drinking by myself at home. Initially, we all thought that you just kind of had to stay home for a couple of weeks. And I remember making this conscious decision with myself of like 2 weeks. Oh, that's fine. Like I could just be drunk for a couple of weeks. And then, once all this settles down, just go back to our normal lives. But then, that never happened. But the drinking didn't stop either. So over the next few months, I started making some really bad decisions. I was a bad father, bad employee. I was still working for Bacardi. I was lucky enough that Bacardi kept me on the payroll. They got rid of a lot of their ambassadors, but I was one of the few that they kept. So I was, just getting paid. I didn't really have to work much. And it was actually my ex-wife who told me essentially, if you want to have a relationship with your dog, like you need to stop drinking. My mom brought it up to me a few times, but it was really then that I realized like, all right, I need to sit down and look at myself in the mirror here and figure out what I'm doing, because my daughter's the most important thing. And I was at risk of losing her, and rightfully so from my ex-wife's perspective.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of stuff to kind of all come up there, right? I get it though. I get it where you're just like, yeah, I mean, it's a couple weeks, right? We didn't really know what to expect in the whole COVID time, how things were going to play out. You're in the restaurants too, sort of in that space. So even though they're, keeping you on the payroll, like you're probably not doing as much as you maybe were before, right? With going to places.
No, I mean, bars in Chicago shut down. They weren't allowed to be open. And
yeah,
I know there were other parts of the country where they were still very active, but Chicago locked down. You were not allowed to do anything. So I was getting paid, but I had no job.
Yeah. And then the interesting thought there too, right? Maybe I'll just carry this on for 2 weeks. And I always think about those stories about, people who have a slip or a relapse. And it's that thought of, I'll just have one. And then it carries on for 5 years. And I'm almost thinking of that in kind of like a reverse thing of, I'll just open up the tap here for a couple weeks and then I'll just kind of turn it off. And,
Sure.
For a lot of people, I'm sure there's a ton of people out there, Thomas, who they did that, right? They were able to do that 1 week into COVID. And then they're like, oh, well, okay, this is too much. I'll just turn the tap off. And then there's probably some people like us, right? Where it's once it opens, we can't close it up. We can't just scale back. We can't just, okay, well, I'm having this many and then I'll just, scale back. And it might work for a little bit, but it's a little bit different for everybody's situation. So was the separation with your wife? I mean, did alcohol play a role looking back in that sort of going forward?
A lot of things did, but alcohol was definitely part of it. I was drinking a lot during our marriage. There were a few times that, she would get upset with me about, drinking too much. And I wouldn't say it's the straw that broke the camel's back, But I mean, it was definitely a factor, but at the time, we would go out and drink together, and she's one of those, crazy people to an alcoholic that can, have a couple drinks and stop and call it a day, where I never had that ability. If we go out and we're going to a bar, and we spent a lot of time at bars because it was my job, I had a hard time stopping. It nearly impossible. The idea of having a beer was a foreign concept to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had some issues definitely that, stemmed from drinking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, throughout all this time too, did you ever try to cut back at all? Now, a lot of people share about attempted moderation. I'm going to scale back, or I'm not going to hang out with these people, or I'll keep 6 in the fridge.
There were a few times, but all of them were in response to a fight that we would have, where she would say, "You're drinking too much. Like, I'm so done with your shit." I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on here, so I apologize. Yeah. I have a terrible mouth. Where she'd say, "I'm done." And I was like, all right, I'll slow down. I'll stop. And then maybe for the next 3 or 4 days, I'd only have a couple of whiskeys. And then by the end of the next week, though, just fully back at it. I mean, the real attempts at sobriety came for me when I realized I have a serious problem and I need to stop. And that's when we were a few months into COVID that, I realized, oh shit, like this is not good.
Yeah. And it's so interesting too, right? Because I mean, I can relate with you too a lot on that. People from the outside mentioning things, but I think when I look back in my story, it was the fear of what is my life going to look like without this? This thing, alcohol, that I've depended on so greatly, and I've built my identity around, and it's such a big part of my life. What is it going to look like without it? How am I going to deal with the emotions, the feelings that are coming into my life without this? Because for me, it was like a good day, drink, a bad day, drink. It didn't really matter what was going on around me. It was just, that's the way it was going down. And I was so worried about what would things look like, or what would people think, and all this other stuff, that once I got sober, I was like, none of that stuff even matters, but it held me back. I felt like it held me back for some time. You mentioned there too, like things are spiraling during, this phase. I mean, where do they end up? And then how do you, eventually turn this thing around, and your job there with Bacardi, and how do things progress for you from here?
My job was still my job. And they basically said, there's not much to do, but we're keeping you on. So my job wasn't at jeopardy first. My relationship, part of me was still trying to save it with my ex-wife. So we were spending time together and hanging out and doing the whole co-parenting thing. But I think that I was taking it hard, because at the end of the night, after I would help her put my daughter to bed or do whatever, I'm going home back to my empty, now small apartment that I have. And, I'm depressed about it. So I'm drinking, and it just spiraled. And it got to the point where my ex told me that, if you want to have a relationship with your daughter, you stop drinking. And my boss called me at one point, because while I didn't have all the same responsibilities, I still had some, and I was completely shirking those professionally. And I would just sleep through, Zoom meetings that we had or something. And she called me and just asked if I was doing okay, and told me that she thinks that I need to take medical leave and just address what's ever going on. She didn't want to say alcoholism, working for a liquor company. And to be clear, Bacardi was phenomenal about all of this. Everybody knew what was going on. And they were the ones who also, they told me, go address it. You're still on the payroll, but, don't come back until you have your shit figured out. So I did that, and I took a few stabs at sobriety, true, genuine, like good old college tries, where I would dry out and I would go to a meeting or two. And, it's the classic tale that every addict has told, or at least everyone I know, which is, 2 weeks in, I'd go, I got it out of my system. I think I could do this. And then, I could have a beer, and then 4 days later, I'm waking up from another bender, and did that a few times before I finally realized that I can't drink at all, because, there is no turning it off. There is no drinking in moderation. So that's when I really started to ask for help. I basically moved in with my mom for a while. I had this apartment that I was paying for, but I was just never there. Couldn't trust myself enough to not go drink. I did 30 and 30 at, AA meetings. I reached out to my old boss, who was a great buddy of mine to this day, saying I need help. And that's when I really kind of embraced it and realized that there is no moderation for me. There's complete abstinence or jumping off the cliff. And I would much rather abstain. It's the only way that I'll stay alive and have a relationship with my daughter and have a job and have relationships and friends and all of that. And, it's funny when you were saying that you were concerned when you got sober about, what are other people going to think? And I had those exact same fears at first. And I remember, after my first few week break, the first time walking into a bar, because they were starting to slowly reopen, very controlled, very restricted when they could be open. And, you had to stay a certain distance apart. And I remember being so scared to walk into a bar where I knew everybody. And, by that time, it had just become common practice that whenever I'd walk into a bar, the bartender would look at me and give me the international sign of, want a shot? So I walk in and the, bartender looks at me. I was like, no, I actually stopped drinking. And I was so nervous to say that. But I'll never forget that the bartender, who's still a good friend of mine, looked at me and went, yeah, probably good, probably for the best. And I was like, oh, okay. Wow. Well, yeah. Everyone knows. All right, cool. And then never looked back.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm wondering too, what was your mom's reaction to this when you asked for this help and everything you're going through?
Oh, incredibly supportive. She, looking back, she was at the forefront of asking whether or not I had a problem for many years. So when I did finally admit that I had an issue, she opened her doors, told me, stay as long as you want. The nights that I did have my daughter, which were becoming more and more rare because of my drinking and everything that I was going through, my daughter and I would just stay at her house. My daughter had a bed there. I would, sleep on the fold out. And she was incredibly supportive. And she's definitely on the list of people that I don't think I would be sober, let alone alive, probably, if it weren't for her support.
Yeah. And how hard was it to have those conversations with your mom and maybe other people as well too? I do have a problem. I feel like for me, it was really hard. There was freedom in it because I was finally like, okay, this cat's out of the bag. This is incredible. But I also felt like I struggled a little bit because now the cat's out of the bag and now I got to do something about it and people are going to hold me to a different standard. What was that experience like for you?
I was concerned, but at the same time, it wasn't coming out of the blue. It's not this thing that I just randomly sprung on her, very much like my bartender friends. When I said, hey, I need to stop drinking, my mom was like, yeah, I know, I've been telling you this, like, you need to stop. So I was nervous. It's not a conversation I wanted to have. I was embarrassed that I was living at my mom's house as a 33-year-old adult man with a job and a career and a kid. I took it harder than it needed to be taken. I processed it much harder than anyone else. I was the hardest on myself, is what I'm trying to say. My mom was incredibly supportive and we just had a conversation and, she had the experience with my father. He was sober before they met too, but they always talked about it. We like to talk about this. And so she had some ideas and knew that there were meetings that I should go to and people that I should call. And, she kind of coached me through a lot of it in the early days. So I was very lucky to have a supportive mother through this part and supportive friends and supportive family. And, everyone in my life was very supportive. But yeah, it's not a conversation I wanted to have ever.
Yeah. But I think it's so important, right? I think it's so important. And even I'm just gathering from your story, and correct me if I'm wrong here. The other times when you were getting a week or you were getting a couple of days, it sounds like you were doing that kind of on your own. Like you're still kind of harboring this thing and you might go to a meeting or two, but it's not completely out there. Like I've surrendered. I cannot do this moderation. I cannot do this on my own. I need help. And I hear a lot of stories. It really seems to change the game for people when we're able to get out of our own way and just put it out there. And you know what? What we're so worried and scared and fearful about is just like your mom's response. I know. And the
Yeah.
bartender buddy, you know what I mean? Everybody already knows. We're not fooling anyone.
Yeah. I mean, I think that my first few stabs at it, it's the classic saying of you can't get sober for anyone else. You have to do it for you. And I think the first few times that I thought like, all right, I'm going to stop drinking. One, I didn't really fully think I had a problem. I didn't think that I needed to stop drinking. I thought that I needed to show people that I could not drink. So I would go do that for a couple of weeks and be like, see, everything's great. And then it didn't work out, obviously. So I think it was the first time, when I really sat there and realized like I am powerless to alcohol. And I know that's, step one is admitting that you have this problem and that you cannot control it. You are powerless to this thing, be it alcohol or drugs or whatever your addiction is. When I, really said like, all right, I can't do this. I have no control over this. It's an affliction and I need outside help. And that's when it got serious.
Yeah. I love that you brought up there that, maybe the other times it was maybe for other stuff, right? You'll hear, people with kids, right? Of course, you want the best for our kids and we want to get sober for them. And they definitely play a massive role in it. And it can be a springboard. I think for some people, they want a better relationship. It could be a springboard. But I think at some point in this process, we've got to come back to what you mentioned, right? You have to do it for yourself. Why do you feel that's like essential to this process?
Because I think that until you tell yourself that the only way you're going to succeed or the only way you're going to have a family or friends or a job is to do it for yourself, is finally realizing that you are powerless over this. Like you have to want to do it for you because otherwise it's not going to stick. If you're doing it to appease someone else or to keep a job, it's almost like you have this mental block in your head of going, I'm not an addict, but I need to demonstrate to them that I'm not an addict. But until you admit it, it's an uphill battle. It's always an uphill battle, but it's like the steepest uphill battle until you say, no, I do have a problem. I do have to do this for me. It's the only chance I have. And I remember talking to my buddy, my sponsor for a while, and he asked, this is after I've been sober for a little while. And he asked me, what's the most important thing in your life? I was like, my daughter. That's easy. And he goes, wrong. And I was like, all right, shit, what is it? Like my job? He goes, no, not even close. And he goes, your sobriety is the most important thing to you because without it, you lose your daughter, you lose your job, you lose your family, you lose all of it. So the most important thing in your life has to be your sobriety. And when I realized that and realized that I was doing it for me and indirectly doing it so that I can have all these other things is when it really kind of hit me and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And that's when I started to get it.
I love that. And that's so true. Yeah. I mean, what's the other expression? Anything we put in front of our sobriety will be the first thing we lose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's making that conscious decision every day just to get another day, not drink today. That's it. For me anyway, I try to keep things real simple. That way I have a better chance of following through with them. I don't want to complicate it too much. Okay, so take us to the day you get sober.
The day that I finally got sober, I had about 6 months of sobriety in at this point. And then, I was dating this new person and, I was unsure whether or not I should even be in a relationship. And I was just kind of going through a lot. And I decided just kind of on a whim of, let's just have a beer. I don't have my daughter for a few days. She's with her mom, and just have a beer and just kind of reflect and think about things. And as it goes every time, 3 days had passed. I had missed meetings. This girl that, I was interested in had kind of disappeared because I wasn't responding to her texts or phone calls or anything. And then What was different about that time is it was the first time that I came out of one of those stretches on my own, where I woke up one day and said, like, I can't, like, I didn't have anyone telling me I needed to stop drinking. I didn't have anyone show up to my house and kind of drag me out of bed. I got up and, I went to my mom's house and just said, I did it again and I need help. And I looked at the calendar and it was Father's Day of 2021, which looking back, I think it was incredibly symbolic, and never had a drink since. And it was hard, starting that whole 30 meetings in 30 days thing over again, having to tell my buddies, my sober friends, like, I fucked up again. It was really hard, but it stuck. And I'm also thrilled to say that girl that I was kind of worried about, we're still together, just bought a house together and are planning to get married. It really does get better. It gets so much better. But the day that I got sober was, obviously it's the most important day of my life. It's up there with the day that my daughter was born, because that's when it all kind of started over for me.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. I mean, was that emotional in any way? I mean, you're coming out of this 3-day bender in a sense there, and then it's lands on Father's Day and the importance of all of that.
I don't think I was that emotional about it at the time, but I think looking back on it, the symbolism of it all has really hit me a few times. And, we're recording this on May 30th, I think it is. So Father's Day is in a couple of weeks, and I don't even know what the actual date was of Father's Day in 2021. I just know that my sober day is Father's Day. And I think that's really cool because I'm a father, and I wouldn't be if it weren't for my sobriety. And yeah, so it definitely has a bit of an emotional impact on me for sure.
That's beautiful, man. What's been helpful for you, over the last, 3 years, right? And I'm also curious too, because a lot of stuff happens throughout the journey, right? Throughout the part of the addiction and while that's living on. And I'm always so curious to see, we never want to bring pain into our life. We never want to experience loss and go through all that stuff. I don't think so anyway. But part of me in my story thinks I had to go through some stuff to get through some stuff.
Yep.
I don't know if I would have ended up here where I am. I don't think without some sort of consequences, without some sort of the world kind of picking me up, just grabbing my shirt and just shaking me a little bit. And I would love to hear sort of your thoughts if everything that kind of led you up to here was maybe preparing you for this decision, and then what's been helpful for you moving forward.
Well, I don't think there are a lot of people sitting there going, wow, everything's going really great. I should stop drinking, or I should stop using drugs. I think it's when you kind of bottom out of it that you have this moment, you have an option to either address it or not. So I think that every addict, every alcoholic, you've gone through some shit. You've gone through some hard times, and that's what brings you to this decision that you have to make. But I think that, one of the things that I've had to really learn how to do is process hard things. And, for many years, I'm sure you can relate to this. You had a bad day, you would just go drink and, kind of numb yourself and turn it off. And now that I'm sober, when I have a bad day, I have to sit there and process these emotions and these feelings. And at first I hated it more than anything, like the stress, the anxiety, all these negative thoughts that you have. It's terrible when you're going through it for essentially the first time as an adult. But then what I learned is that by going through it, by feeling these things, by having the stress, by having the anxiety, by feeling these negative thoughts and feelings, is that you can then address it. You can come up with a game plan. You can strategize. What do I need to do to get out of this? Where when I was drinking, I never had that train of thought. It was just try to drink until it either goes away or something worse happens that trumps it. I love the fact that now I have to sit there and process and feel things, because otherwise I'm not going to get through it. You have to feel the hurt and feel the pain before you address it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 110%. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I didn't have any resilience skills at all to work through difficult situations,
Sure.
how to process feelings or how to problem solve. Like I look back to, right? And now there's a quote too in 12 Step Fellowship. You probably know it better than I do, but about like previous things baffling us and it won't anymore. You
Sure.
know, like just being extremely overwhelmed with how things were. Like I just remember the smallest things would just send me in a spiral where I just could not see a way out of. And now stuff happens and I'm just like in the big picture of life, a lot of things don't hit heavy like they would have before. I'm able to learn those skills, right? Resilience, working through stuff, learning, paying attention to it instead of like with you. I mean, I'm just numbed out to the fact of everything, right? When the drink just becomes the reach, the solution, then we don't need to push to develop anymore. And then when we get sober, it's I'm with you too, man. It's okay. What do I do here? What do I do in this social situations? Things are awkward. Things are weird. I don't know what to say, what to do. But the more we do it, the more comfortable it becomes. And then it's like now in my life, it's just a way of life, you know, where drinking and drug use for me were a way of life before. And it was just regular and it was just normalized and it's just what I did. Now it's sobriety is the way of life. And I don't know any other way of life in a sense.
Yeah. I think that, you and I are very fortunate because, it sounds like you and I are in the same boat where it's not even really something that I think about anymore. It's not something that I miss anymore. There are definitely times there are some drinking experiences that I miss, for some reason, airports. I miss being able to have an airport beer. It's things like that. But I don't sit here and just wish, man, I wish I could drink. Those days are behind me because sobriety is, the only way of life that I know at this point. And I think that's a great thing. I think that, people who are still sitting there and just thinking about it all the time and craving booze and, just wanting it so badly and having it be such a occupying part of their thought process. That's when it gets dangerous, I feel. And I feel like that's where I was in the very early stages of this whole process. So yeah, I'm going to make it 2 weeks, but I'm going to be thinking about drinking that entire time. And I've just accepted that this is my life now. I just don't drink. It's the only thing I know at this point.
Yeah. And then I like that too, because I got a sense that you like to keep it simple like I do. I just don't drink. And I mean, that's all it is at the end of the day. And I mean, there's a lot of other things that go into getting to that place. I think when we first start out this process, we want that to happen overnight. And you touched on the instant gratification earlier on with getting cash money, a few $100 a night early on in your bartending career. And you get that dopamine and it's great and things are good. And then I think when we struggle with drinking, we get that instant gratification of the relief of whatever when we're drinking. And then when we get into sobriety, hey, we can't change a decade overnight or even 2 decades or 3, right? Everybody's got a different story. We want things to shape up, right away and everything to just make a ton of sense. And for me anyway, it didn't because I dealt with those raw emotions like what you're talking about. I didn't know how to process things. I had to look at my relationships that I had with people. I had to start hanging out at different places. I had to move a lot differently in life. And it took a little bit of time, but it's so hopeful that it gets there, because people just starting out, is it ever going to be any different? And I'm just like, I'm telling you, you stick with it, you do the work. There's going to be a time in your life where you're just going to be like, that was what was. And yeah, in the romanticizing is kind of what I mention about it is, you see the people on the patio for the summer and it's, man, it would be nice to have a cold drink on the patio with everybody. But in my mind, I just play the tape forward. It was never a cold drink on a patio for me. It was never 1 or 2. It was never hanging out with the boys. It was hanging out with the boys. They all went home to their life and they carried on. I went to the store, got more, passed out, and couldn't tell you left from right at the end of it. Woke up feeling shame, guilt. What did I do? Here we go again. So I always just remind myself that as attractive as it may appear at times, that was never my story. Well, it wasn't never my story. When I first started, that was probably my story. But there was a time in there where things changed. Things flipped around and that wasn't my story and I could never get back. I tried so hard to get back to how it once was. Like, can I just please get back to the beginning and I never found my way back. Thank you so much, though, Thomas, so much for sharing your story with us, man. I want to hear, wondering about too, the Bacardi thing, because we talked a bit before we jumped off that you're doing another job now. Did you do that job as well once you got sober? You still held that position?
I did. I did for a while. And, Bacardi, I remember telling them, I'm worried. I don't know how to do this job sober and not drinking. And my boss at the time told me, like, we never said you had to drink. We never told you to go drink at the bars. We told you to go to bars. You could be having a Diet Coke. You'd just be sitting there for all we care. You're the one who decided to go drink like a monster every night. But it was a challenge. I'm not going to lie. Working in the liquor industry, especially in that capacity where my job is to encourage other people to drink, where in the back of my head, I felt like I don't believe in this anymore. I know what it's done to me. It always kind of nagged at me. And I used to be very passionate about spirits. I don't mean just drinking them. I mean, how they're made, the history of these brands, cocktails, like everything about alcohol itself. It fascinated me. And when I stopped drinking, I very quickly lost that passion. So I realized that if I'm not going to do this job well, then why am I doing it? I don't care about any of this anymore. I don't care about this bar. I care about the people who work at the bars, but I lost interest. So my half-sister's husband works in construction. He sells large construction projects to schools, and he has a very lovely life. And he had been trying to get me to come join his company for years at this point. And I always said, no, man, like I got this awesome job. Like my whole job is to like hang out and party and travel. Why? Like, what? You want me to go work in schools? But then I finally did give him a call. And so like, all right, I'm in. So that's what I've been doing for the last about just over 2 years now, 2 years and 4 months or something, is selling construction projects to schools. And it's, the last few years have been a real doozy. I stopped drinking. I am in a new relationship. I have a new house and started a new career, but none of it would be possible if I was still drinking the way that I was.
And looking back, this was a great transition for you though, right? To move into this other thing and kind of close that chapter.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, the transition's been a great thing for me. And I think that if you are working in the industry and want to get sober, there's a lot of ways to do it. But for me, I just found it was easier to just kind of remove myself from it.
Yeah. Just before we wrap up here, if somebody's listening, because I mean, you have that extensive background too, working in that hospitality umbrella. I mean, what would you mention to the person out there who's struggling, with drinking and wondering, do I have a problem? If I do get sober, like maybe I'll have to leave all of this behind, or maybe I won't. Maybe there's a way that I could still find my lane and maybe do what I enjoy. What would you mention to that person?
You don't have to leave the industry, but I would say that if you're questioning it, what you should do is tonight, when you get off work, just go home and put on a TV show and go to bed. And if you find that's impossible, maybe you do have an issue. Maybe it is something that you should address or look into. But also, I mean, talk to the community, people in restaurants, they all know each other. And I guarantee that there's more sober people working in bars and restaurants than you think. There are a lot. And find them and talk to them and ask them how they did it.
Yeah, I think that's great too, right? Talk with other people and kind of maybe get ahead of this thing, right? Because in most stories, it's progressive. So how it looks today is not how it might look in 5 years if we just keep going with it. Yeah, great stuff. And there is, man. I've had tons of people on the show that they got sober there and they had mentors there and then people helped them in restaurants, in bars. And I know this one person actually that she's a bartender still. And I can only imagine too, if you're sober and you're doing the bartending thing, the money's even more incredible because you're not spending it after work on everything else, right? But thank you so much, Thomas, for bringing the insight, man. Huge congrats on everything and
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me. Really happy and proud to be a part of this. You do a great show and great Instagram page. And, when I initially dried out, one of the first things I did was try to look up sober Instagram pages, and you came up. You and your community has been a huge help from day one for me. So I'm very honored to be here talking now.
Beautiful, man. Love it. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, there it is, everyone. Another incredible episode here on the podcast. Thank you, Thomas, so much for coming on and sharing your story with all of us. I'll drop Thomas's contact information down in the show notes below if you want to connect or just to say thank you. Also, be sure to leave a review for the podcast on Apple or Spotify. It helps so much if you're enjoying the stories, enjoying any aspect of the show. Take a few minutes out of your busy day. It would mean the world. And I'll see you on the next one.